The Justice Department says it does not expect to receive a report from special counsel Robert Mueller for at least another 10 days. The report will be delivered to the new Attorney General, William Barr, who will have to decide if and what portions will be made public. At the White House Friday, President Trump says he has not discussed the report with his new Attorney General and once again called the Russia investigation a hoax.
At some point, I guess I'll be talking about it. But you know the nice part? There was no collusion. There was no obstruction. There was no anything. So that's the nice part. There was no phone calls, no nothing. We have I won a race. You know why I won the race? Because I was a better candidate than she was and had nothing to do with Russia. And everybody knows it's a hoax. It's one of the greatest hoaxes ever perpetrated on this country. So I look forward to seeing the report. If it's an honest report, it will say that. If it's not an honest report, it won't.
Zeke Miller is a CBSN political contributor and White House reporter for the Associated Press. Zeke, before we get to what we just heard from the president, President Trump has recently nominated the U.S. ambassador to Canada, Kelly Knight-Craft, to be the next U.S. ambassador to the UN. What can you tell us about her background and what does she bring to this post?
Well, she brings an easier confirmation battle, and that's something that this White House needed after its last pick for the job. Heather Nauert was forced to withdraw over the weekend after her nomination had languished for a couple of months. Kelly Craft had been pushed by everyone from Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and John Bolton inside the White House as a safe pick for the president of the three that he was considering for that post. And for the president here really needs a win, and that was the safest pick from him, and that's why we saw that announcement today.
Switching gears to the Mueller report, what are you hearing from your sources and from inside the White House about the release of the report and what the timing really is?
Well, the White House really is taking its cues the same way, from all of us. We're all consuming the same news stories about this. They don't have a whole lot of special intelligence or heads up that they're getting. There's a very limited communication between the special counsel's team and the president's legal team and the White House. And the communications between the White House and the Justice Department on this are very, very limited because they want to avoid the appearances of impropriety. So the White House has begun preparing for the Mueller report to be released imminently, the same way there are reports that it could come out anytime the next several days. The Justice Department today, though, saying it will be after certainly the president comes back from Vietnam. So that was a little bit of a stay there from what they were expecting. But interestingly, the White House is preparing for it, but they don't have a whole lot of inside knowledge. As one might expect in instances like this. They're taking their cues from the reporting.
Sounds like they might get the word when this is released when we do.
Certainly, potentially, there may be a few minutes heads up or a couple of hours potentially, but by and large, they're expecting to find out, if not simultaneously with the general public, but within a couple of hours of it.
I wonder, is the White House concerned at all about congressional investigations, even if there are no major bombshells in this report?
They absolutely are, not just regarding what the special counsel is investigating Russia, some of the president's prior business dealings, and there's certainly areas that might not fall within the purview of the special counsel that Democrats on Capitol Hill and even some Republicans might want to look into. But the White House has staffed up over the last several months to try to fend off all of these Democratic investigations, not just the president's background and his campaign, but also his actions while in office. A lot of those are areas we're starting to see action and activity pick up on Capitol Hill. They've hired lawyers. They've designated a deputy press secretary to handle inquiries from the press about those issues. It's a sign of a White House that is gearing up to go to battle with Congress over the next couple of years.
And this, as Democrats are moving forward with a resolution to terminate the president's national emergency declaration. The president has said that he will veto it. What does all of this mean for his promises to build a wall at the southern border?
Well, for all intents and purposes, the president cannot make good on that promise by the time voters decide on his fate next year. Just from a practical standpoint, the contracting, the permitting, taking the land, the fund, and that's setting aside the funding issue. If they got the money today, it could not be done next year. And that's an issue that the president is just really starting to come to grips with. His supporters are certainly, a little uneasy about that, and the White House and the president's campaign are worried about how the president's voters will react to that, because that was such a central promise to his campaign. The issue of the national emergency, with Congress set to vote on a motion of resolution of disapproval next week in the House. The president has no choice but to veto. This whole exercise, though, of the emergency really is a bit of an act by the president to try to make it clear to his supporters and voters that he's doing everything in his power, and maybe in this case beyond his power, to try to build the wall. The question is that going to be enough for voters if they look at the southern border where there is no wall in a lot of places like he had promised back in 2016? They don't know, but that's really this is the only hand the president has to play right now. It really is fight, fight, fight. Statements, emergencies, doing everything he can to try to make it look like he's not given up on that wall.
President Trump met with Chinese officials at the White House Friday. The administration and China are trying to negotiate a trade deal before tariffs on some imports more than double next month. What is the latest on these negotiations?
Well, the most important thing we've seen out of that meeting is the president is now saying that March 1st deadline is not set in stone. He's publicly floating, potentially delaying that to allow these talks to continue. There are some memoranda of understanding that have been drafted between the two parties over the last several weeks. That's a sign of promise for those talks, but the chances of something this big getting done in the next week. The president acknowledged that probably won't happen, that they might need additional bit of time. And the president sort of hinting at a future meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping, potentially at his private club in Florida next month. And that would be an indication, if the president were to push off that tariff deadline, it'd probably be after that meeting to try to create, again, another sort of a pressure point on the Chinese to come to the table and actually make some concessions.
And finally, Zeke, we are less than a week away from President Trump's second summit with Kim Jong-un in Vietnam. Is the White House laying out any goals or expectations for the meeting between the two leaders?
They are not. They're keeping it. They're trying to cast this as almost a preliminary meeting for further talks. There has not been a whole lot of progress on the task of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula since the president and Chairman Kim met last year in Singapore. There's been a lot of talk. There have been a lot of flowery letters going back and forth and glowing statements from both countries, from both leaders back and forth. But there's a lot of skepticism within the White House that North Korea actually wants to make a deal on this front. Certainly with the intelligence community and on Capitol Hill, we've seen a lot of that skepticism over the last several months. The president, though, we're told, is very confident that he can, extract some sorts of concessions from the North Koreans next week. But just how much will it have to be in order for the president to come walk out and claim victory? That remains to be determined.
All right, Zeke Miller at the White House. Zeke, thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me.